It's funny. When I think about the financial sector and climate change, it's almost like I'm watching one of those old silent films.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you see all this action, all this movement, but there's no sound, no real dialogue.
Mm.
Like on the surface, you get all the greenwashing, the sustainability pledges, the big pronouncements about going net zero, but it always feels a bit like a performance?
I see what you mean.
Like, what if you could actually listen in on the conversations happening behind closed doors, like the real risk assessments and the internal strategy sessions? I have a feeling you'd hear a very different story unfolding.
That's a really intriguing way to frame it, and it actually gets to the heart of what we're exploring in this deep dive today.
Oh, does it?
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at this sort of quiet acceptance of catastrophic climate change
Mm-hmm.
that seems to be emerging within the financial sector, like a unspoken consensus.
Unspoken consensus.
Yeah,
Okay.
and we'll be digging into what that means in practice, particularly in the context of, well, everything that's going on right now.
Right. The whole shebang.
Exactly. So we're talking about the political dynamics, the backlash against ESG, all those institutions pulling out of the climate alliances, the fact that some parts of the world seem to be way more prepared for climate impacts than others,
Yeah.
what central banks are doing and not doing, and ultimately what this all means for the future of, sustainable finance, especially as we head towards COP30.
Right, because that's coming up pretty quickly.
It is.
Okay, so to do this deep dive, we've been combing through a whole bunch of sources, really trying to get a sense of what's going on beneath the surface.
Yeah, a lot of fascinating stuff in there.
So we've got industry reports that give us a glimpse into like the actual thinking within financial institutions. We've got internal analyses from these companies where they lay out different climate
Oh,
scenarios.
yeah, those are always interesting.
Right. And then we've got news articles tracking all the political maneuvering and financial shifts, and some really eye-opening research on how central banks are approaching this whole climate risk thing.
A lot of moving pieces.
So our goal with all of this is to, well, like we always do, try to make sense of it all for you.
Cut through the noise.
Exactly, to provide some clarity and context, because frankly, a lot of the signals out there are pretty darn confusing.
I agree.
So if we can help you understand these big shifts happening within finance when it comes to climate change, and maybe shed some light on what it all means for the future we're all heading towards, then we'll consider this deep dive a success.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So where do we even begin with all of this? I guess we should start with this idea of a quiet acceptance of climate catastrophe. What exactly does that even mean?
Well, it's this idea that, behind the scenes, many major financial players are increasingly coming to terms with the fact that we're on a trajectory towards significantly more global warming than what the Paris Agreement was hoping to achieve.
Okay, so we're talking about like exceeding those Paris targets. So
Yeah.
not just 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming, but potentially even more.
Exactly. And what's really striking is that it's not just a few fringe institutions thinking this way.
Right. It's not just like the doomsayers.
Yeah, we're talking about some of the biggest names in finance, like Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan Chase, the Institute of International Finance. They're all starting to plan for a world that's significantly hotter.
Okay, and this isn't just them like speculating, right? This is actually influencing their business decisions.
Absolutely. This is about how they manage their own risks, how they develop their investment strategies, how they advise their clients.
So in one of the reports we looked at, I think it was from Morgan Stanley, they straight up said they were now expecting a 3-degree sea world.
Yeah, that was pretty explicit.
And I remember reading that this came after the US election, right?
Yeah, so they basically updated their internal climate scenarios to reflect the new political realities.
So they're factoring in things like policy changes, the potential for slower progress on emissions reductions, all of that.
Exactly. And they're not alone. Like I said, JP Morgan Chase and the Institute of International Finance have similar assessments.
So it's safe to say this is more than just like a hypothetical exercise for them.
Oh, absolutely. This is about figuring out how to remain profitable in a world that's going to be fundamentally reshaped by severe climate impacts.
It's kind of like they're quietly acknowledging that things could get really bad, really disruptive, but they're not necessarily shouting it from the rooftops.
That's a good way to put it. And it's particularly interesting when you consider what's happening on the policy front, especially in places like the U.S.
Right, because here in the U.S., we've actually seen a rollback of some climate policies, a renewed focus on fossil fuels.
Exactly. It's like this weird disconnect where you've got these financial institutions internally bracing for a potentially very different future while the political winds seem to be blowing in the opposite direction.
I mean, does that make any sense?
It's definitely a tension that's worth unpacking, and I think it gets to the heart of how Financial institutions are trying to balance their, long-term risk assessments with short-term political and regulatory pressures.
Okay, so let's say, for argument's sake, that these institutions are right, and we do end up in this three-degree world. What are some of the specific consequences that they're likely factoring into their planning?
Well, the picture painted by the sources is, frankly, pretty sobering.
Oh, yeah.
Lay it on me. Okay, so we're talking about widespread droughts, like really severe droughts leading to major crop failures, disruptions in the food supply chain, all of that.
Oh, wow.
And then you've got sea level rise, much higher than what we're currently anticipating, which means coastal cities, critical infrastructure, all of that is increasingly at risk.
Yikes.
And then there's the extreme heat, particularly in equatorial and tropical regions. We're talking about temperatures that could make it impossible to work outdoors for large parts of the year.
That's insane, and I imagine that would have huge knock-on effects for things like agriculture, construction, all sorts of industries.
Absolutely. And the economic consequences are projected to be massive. Talking about damage to infrastructure, declining agricultural yields, plummeting property values, all happening on a global scale.
It's like a domino effect. One thing leads to another, and it just keeps spiraling.
Exactly. And to give you a sense of the scale of the financial risks involved, think back to those wildfires we had in Los Angeles earlier this year.
Oh, yeah, those were brutal.
And the estimated losses were staggering, like potentially up to $164 billion in property and capital losses and $75 billion just in insured losses.
That's just one event in one region, and we're already talking about tens of billions of dollars in damages.
Exactly. And that's in a world that hasn't even reached that 3-degree threshold yet.
So it's like a glimpse into what could become much more commonplace, much more widespread.
Precisely. And it raises a really crucial question. Are these financial institutions really truly grasping the interconnectedness of these risks?
Like, are they really thinking about the systemic implications? How one event can trigger a cascade of consequences across the globe?
Yeah, and are their current risk management approaches even equipped to handle the kind of disruption we're talking about?
Right, because it's one thing to plan for a hurricane or an earthquake, but it's a whole other ballgame to prepare for synchronized economic shocks across multiple continents.
Exactly, and that's the level of complexity they're grappling with.
Okay, so we've talked about the internal assessments, the potential consequences, but let's get into the political side of all of this, because it seems like that's playing a huge role in how the financial sector is responding, especially here in the U.S.
Oh, absolutely. The political winds have definitely shifted, and we're seeing that reflected in how financial institutions are behaving.
Like when Trump got back into office, it felt like there was this almost immediate ripple effect throughout the financial world.
Oh, yeah, it was pretty dramatic.
So within, what, weeks of his inauguration, all six of the biggest U.S. banks, J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, Morgan Stanley, they all pulled out of the net zero banking alliance.
Yeah, one after the other, like a domino effect.
And it wasn't just the banks, right? BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, they left a similar initiative for asset managers.
Right, and even the Federal Reserve stepped back from a consortium of regulators that were focused on climate risk.
So this was a pretty coordinated retreat, it seems like.
It was, and I think it really underscores the extent to which the political climate can influence financial decision-making.
So what was the reasoning behind all this? Why did they all suddenly decide to bail on these commitments?
Well, the main explanations seem to be twofold. First, there's this fear of litigation risks, this sense that the political landscape has become much more hostile towards anything that even remotely smells like climate action.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and one of the sources actually quoted a finance professor who said, the political landscape has shifted. Remaining in these alliances exposes you to litigation risks. It's akin to having a target on your back.
A target on your back? Wow, that's pretty stark.
It is, and it seems like this concern wasn't entirely unfounded.
Oh, right, because BlackRock actually got hit with a lawsuit from a bunch of Republican-led states.
Exactly. They were accused of engaging in anti-competitive practices because of their participation in these net zero initiatives.
So it's like they're damned if they do, damned if they don't.
In a way, yeah. And then there's the second factor, which is a broader attempts to align themselves with the new administration's priorities.
So it's about playing it safe, not rocking the boat too much.
Essentially, yeah. And remember, Trump has been very critical of the climate action. He's pulled the U.S. out of international agreements. So there's a sense that these institutions are trying to avoid being seen as, on the wrong side of the political divide.
It's almost like they're hedging their bets, they're acknowledging the risks internally, but they're being very careful about how they act publicly.
It's a very delicate balancing act, for sure.
Now, this pushback against climate action, it's not just limited to the U.S., is it? We're seeing a broader kind of ESG backlash happening globally.
Yeah, that's right. This skepticism towards environmental, social, and governance factors in investing is definitely spreading.
And it seems like that skepticism is actually translating into concrete policy changes in some places.
Oh, yeah. For example, in Europe, there's been a lot of talk about reviewing and potentially even weakening some of their sustainability regulations.
And that's after those elections where some right-wing parties gained ground.
Exactly. And then you've got the ongoing legal challenges against ESG-focused investing in the U.S.
So the political winds are definitely shifting in a way that's making it harder for these financial institutions to publicly champion climate action.
It is, and it's interesting to see how this is playing out in terms of the language they're using. There's definitely been a shift towards emphasizing energy security.
Energy security,
Yeah.
right.
Which often carries this implicit suggestion that we need to maintain reliance on fossil fuels, in the name of national security and economic stability.
And that seems to clash with their own internal assessments about the risks of a rapidly warming world, right?
It does. It creates this sort of cognitive dissonance, like they're operating on two different levels simultaneously.
Now, speaking of different levels, it seems like there's a pretty clear transatlantic divide emerging when it comes to all of this.
Oh, absolutely. European banks are generally staying engaged with climate initiatives while U.S. banks are pulling back.
It's a pretty stark contrast, right?
It is. Like the Net Zero Banking Alliance, for example, still has over 130 members, most of them European.
So they're not letting the political pushback deter them.
It seems not. And it's probably worth noting that European banks face much stricter regulatory and disclosure requirements around sustainability issues.
So there's more pressure on them to actually walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
Yeah, they're being held to a higher standard, at least in terms of transparency and accountability.
But even within the U.S., it's not entirely black and white, right? I think we saw that the CEOs of Bank of America and Citigroup are still personally involved in the Glasgow Alliance for net zero.
Yeah, that's right. Though they did push for some changes to the rules.
Oh, so they're trying to find some middle ground, some way to stay involved without attracting too much negative attention.
It seems so. It's a delicate balancing act for these global institutions.
It must be, trying to navigate these very different political and regulatory landscapes.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the complexity of this whole issue. It's not just about the science. It's not just about the economics. It's about politics. It's about public perception. It's about managing risk on multiple levels.
Okay, so we've got this complex interplay of factors influencing how the financial sector is responding to climate change.
Yeah.
But let's talk about those big climate alliances for a minute, because the whole point of them was to get these institutions to work together, to shift capital away from fossil fuels and towards climate solutions, right?
Exactly. And there was a lot of optimism when these alliances were first launched, especially around COP26.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It felt like a real turning point.
It did. And figures like Mark Carney, who is really championing this whole thing, he talked about how this could finally be the moment where trillions of dollars start flowing towards building a low-carbon economy.
Yeah, he was pretty fired up about it.
He was, and in the Net Zero Banking Alliance, that was the big one, it brought together a huge number of banks from around the world, all committing to align their lending and investment portfolios with this goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees.
It felt like a real moment of collective action.
It did, and there was this sense that finally the financial sector was getting serious about climate change.
But then came the U.S. election, and the whole thing started to unravel.
Yeah, it didn't take long for the cracks to start showing.
And those cracks turned into a full-blown exodus, right? Goldman Sachs was the first to bail, and then it was like everyone else just followed suit.
It was a domino effect. U.S. banks, then Canadian banks, then Australian banks, Japanese banks.
It's like the whole thing just imploded.
In a way, yeah. And now the NZBA is facing a real crisis of confidence. They're even talking about changing the rules.
Oh, really? Like how?
Well, one of the most drastic proposals on the table is to get rid of the requirement for member banks to align their lending with the 1.5-degree target.
Wow, that's like completely undermining the original purpose of the alliance, isn't it?
It is. It basically turns it into a much weaker commitment.
So it's less about actually achieving net zero and more about just looking like you're doing something.
It's a fair criticism.
Yeah.
And the chair of the NZBA, Shargil Bashir, he even acknowledged that the external environment has changed significantly since they launched.
So he's basically admitting that the political pressure is making it difficult for banks to stick to their commitments.
Yeah, it seems so, and it raises a bigger question about these voluntary alliances in general, like how effective can they really be in driving meaningful change?
Right, because if they're so easily influenced by political winds, and if they can just water down their targets when things get tough, then what's the point?
It's a valid concern, and there's actually some research to suggest that these alliances haven't really moved the needle all that much when it comes to actual financing patterns. Yeah, the European Central Bank did an assessment in 2024, and they found that membership in these voluntary alliances, like the NZBA, had a negligible impact on how banks were actually allocating their capital.
So they were talking the talk, but not walking the walk.
Pretty much, and this was even before the big wave of withdrawals.
So you could argue that the alliance was already struggling to live up to its promise.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. And now that all these banks are leaving, it's really a matter of survival for the NZBA, according to Quentin Abano from BankTrack.
I mean, it's got to be pretty demoralizing for the people who are genuinely trying to make this work.
Oh, I'm sure it is. And it definitely undermines the whole idea of collective action on climate change.
So what are the banks saying about all of this? Are they just throwing in the towel on climate altogether?
Not explicitly, no. They're generally trying to frame their departures as purely strategic decisions.
So it's all about managing risk, protecting shareholder value, that kind of thing.
Yeah, like BlackRock, for example, they said they were leaving the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative because there was too much confusion around the requirements, and they were getting a lot of legal inquiries.
So they're basically saying it was more trouble than it was worth.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
And they were careful to emphasize that they're still committed to sustainable investing, just not within the framework of this particular alliance.
Right, right. And the banks that left the NZBA, they're saying similar things, like they're still going to help their clients with their climate goals. They're just not going to be part of this formal alliance anymore.
Exactly. It's a lot of careful PR spin.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, actions speak louder than words, right?
They do. And I think this whole exodus sends a pretty clear signal about where the priorities lie.
It's like a step backwards, and it definitely widens the gap between those who are serious about climate action and those who are just paying lip service.
And it's not going unnoticed. Climate advocacy groups have been pretty vocal in their criticism.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, some are calling it a disgraceful reversal,
Yeah.
a betrayal of the commitments made at COP26.
Right, because it felt like there was this real momentum building after COP26, and now it's like the air has been let out at the tires.
Exactly. And it's especially disheartening given the increasing frequency and severity of climate-related disasters,
Yeah.
like what we saw in LA.
It's like we're getting a taste of what the future could hold, but instead of doubling down on our efforts, we're taking a step back.
It's a worrying trend for sure.
Okay, so we've talked about the political dynamics, the retreat from these climate alliances.
Mhm.
But there's another piece of this puzzle that we haven't really touched on yet, and that's the question of adaptation. Like, how prepared are these institutions for the actual physical impacts of climate change that are already happening?
That's a crucial question.
Mm-hmm.
And it gets to this idea of climate adaptation maturity.
Okay, climate adaptation maturity, what's that all about?
Basically, it's a measure of how well banks understand, assess, and manage the risks that come with the physical impacts of climate change.
So we're talking about things like more extreme weather events, sea level rise, all the tangible consequences of a warming world.
Exactly. And there was a report that came out recently that really put a spotlight on this issue.
Yeah. What did it say?
Well, it looked at the 50 largest commercial banks in the world, and the results were pretty sobering. It found that 88% of them are not adequately addressing these adaptation risks.
88%. Wow, that's a huge majority.
It is. Only a handful of banks met even half of the criteria for being considered reasonably prepared, and not a single bank met all of them.
So it's like they're acknowledging the problem on a theoretical level, but they're not actually doing what's needed to prepare for the consequences.
Yeah, it seems like there's a big gap between awareness and action.
And the report called out some specific deficiencies, right?
It did. One of the big ones was that banks aren't doing enough to help their clients understand and manage their own physical climate risks.
So they're not providing the guidance, the tools, the support that businesses need to adapt to a changing climate.
Exactly. And the report also criticized banks for not integrating adaptation strategies into their own decision-making processes.
So they're not thinking about how climate change could impact their own operations, their own investments.
Not to the extent that they should be, according to the report.
Okay.
And this is a major vulnerability, especially when you consider the potential for widespread economic disruption from these climate impacts.
Okay, so that's the bad news. But are there any bright spots? Are there any banks that are actually doing a good job on adaptation?
There are, and it's interesting, most of the leaders in this area are European institutions.
Really? So the same trend we saw with the climate alliances, European banks taking the lead.
Yeah, exactly. And some of the top-ranked banks included Standard Chartered from the UK, Banco Santander and BDVA from Spain, UniCredit from Italy. Oh, and even Sberbank from Russia was in the top 5.
Interesting. So it's not just a Western European thing.
It seems not, and I think this points to the importance of regulations and policy environments.
Right, because European countries generally have stricter rules around climate risk disclosure. They're more actively promoting green finance.
Exactly, and that creates a different set of incentives for banks operating in those regions.
So it's not just about corporate culture, it's about the rules of the game, the expectations that are set by governments and regulators.
Absolutely, and the report actually used the term European banking advantage to describe this phenomenon.
European banking advantage, okay.
Yeah, and they pointed to specific things like stress testing, green bond purchases, climate risk disclosure, all areas where European banks are generally ahead of the curve.
So they're not just talking about sustainability, they're actually building it into their core business practices.
Yeah, they're taking a more proactive approach,
Yeah.
and it's showing in their adaptation maturity scores.
Now, on the flip side, who are the laggards in all of this? Who's not doing so well on adaptation?
Well, unsurprisingly, the bottom of the ranking is dominated by U.S. institutions. Yeah, so you've got Japan Post Bank and then 4 big American banks, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs Group, Capital One Financial, and U.S. Bancorp.
So the same names that bailed on the NZBA, they're also not doing so well on adaptation.
Pretty much. And I think this reinforces the point that there's this broader trend of U.S. financial institutions lagging behind on climate readiness.
And it's not just about a lack of political will, right? It's also about a different regulatory environment, a different set of priorities within the financial sector itself.
Yeah, it's a combination of factors.
Okay, so we've talked about banks, but what about central banks? They're playing an increasingly important role in all of this, aren't they?
They are, and it's interesting because traditionally, central banks have been focused on things like financial stability, monetary policy, keeping the economy humming along.
Right, inflation, interest rates, all that good stuff.
Exactly. But increasingly, they're finding themselves drawn into the climate conversation.
Because climate change is an economic issue too, right?
Precisely. It poses significant threats to financial stability, to long-term economic growth.
So they can't just ignore it anymore.
They can't. And since 2016, there's been this growing network of central banks and financial supervisors who are collaborating on climate-related risks. It's called the Network for Greening the Financial System, or NGFS.
NGFS, okay.
Yeah, and they're sharing knowledge, developing best practice, all that good stuff. But it's important to note that there's no one-size-fits-all approach here.
Oh, so different central banks are doing different things.
Yeah, like the People's Bank of China, they've been actively promoting green finance for years. They've got all sorts of policies in place.
So they're really ahead of the curve in some ways.
They are. And then you've got the European Central Bank. They've integrated climate considerations into their main policy reviews, so it's becoming part of their core mandate.
And what about here in the U.S.? What's the Fed doing?
Well, the Fed has been a bit more cautious. They're definitely aware of the risks, but they've been slower to take concrete actions.
And that's probably not surprising given the political climate here, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a factor. And there's actually some interesting research on this whole question of how independent central banks can really be when it comes to climate action.
Whoa.
So a study from Harvard Business School found that central bank action on climate tends to be highly correlated with the national political priorities of their respective countries.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so in countries where climate change is a high political priority, you see central banks taking more aggressive steps, whereas in countries where it's not, central banks are more likely to sit on the sidelines.
So they're not necessarily leading the charge. They're more like following the political winds.
Yeah, that's kind of the takeaway from the study. And it makes sense, right? Central banks are ultimately accountable to their governments.
Yeah, they're not completely independent actors.
Exactly. And this helps to explain why we see such a divergence in central bank approaches around the world.
So like the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the People's Bank of China, they're all actively trying to mitigate climate risks.
Yeah, they're trying to steer the financial system towards a low-carbon future.
But then you've got central banks in places like the U.S., South Korea. They're taking a much more cautious approach.
They are, and it's interesting because even in the U.S., where we're already seeing significant economic damages from climate change, like those wildfires in LA, the Fed is still hesitant to really wade into this issue.
It's like they're caught between a rock and a hard place. They see the problem, but they're constrained by the political context.
It's a tough spot to be in, for sure.
It feels like the conversation is shifting from trying to prevent climate change to trying to adapt to it.
Oh, that's a really sharp observation. And I think you're right. There's definitely a growing sense that we're already locked into a certain amount of warming.
Yeah, and that even if we do everything right, we're still going to have to deal with some pretty significant impacts.
Exactly. And that's driving a shift in the world of sustainable finance. There's much more emphasis now on adaptation.
Adaptation, okay.
Yeah. So instead of just focusing on mitigating emissions, there's this growing recognition that we also need to invest in making our societies, our economies, our infrastructure more resilient to climate impacts.
So it's not just about preventing the problem, it's about learning to live with it.
In a way, yeah, and this is showing up in a lot of different ways, like banks are developing new frameworks for assessing climate resilience. They're identifying investment opportunities in areas like drought-resistant crops, flood defenses, all that kind of stuff.
So it's like a whole new set of priorities is emerging.
It is, and there are some interesting initiatives popping up, like the NDC partnership. They're working with central banks to help them understand and address climate-related financial risks.
And the goal is to make sure that those risks are factored into decision-making, both by governments and by financial institutions.
Exactly, and this shift towards adaptation is also reshaping existing climate finance initiatives, like the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, even though it's been through a lot of turmoil lately.
Oh yeah, all those banks pulling out.
Right. But they're still operating, and they've announced a new focus on unlocking capital for low-carbon transitions in emerging markets.
So it's like they're recognizing that some parts of the world are going to be hit much harder by climate change, and they need more support to adapt.
Exactly, and they're talking about mobilizing trillions of dollars for this, which is a pretty ambitious goal.
It is, and are they thinking about new and innovative ways to get that money flowing?
Yeah, they're talking a lot about blended finance, which basically means using public funds to de-risk private investments.
So it's like a way to encourage more private capital to flow into these climate vulnerable regions.
Exactly. And they're also looking at concessional financing, which is basically loans and grants with more favorable terms.
So it's about making these projects more financially viable, even if they don't necessarily generate huge profits.
Exactly. And all of this is leading up to COP30, which is happening in Brazil next year.
COP30, okay, that's the big UN climate summit, right?
Yeah, and it's being billed as the most important climate negotiation since the Paris Agreement.
Wow, so the stakes are pretty high.
They are, and it's going to be a real test of whether the world can come together on climate finance, especially in this current geopolitical environment with all the divisions and tensions.
Right, because there's a lot of uncertainty out there, a lot of competing priorities.
There is, and there are some key events leading up to COP30, like the Finance and Commons Summit, which is happening alongside the G20 meeting.
Finance and Commons Summit, okay.
Yeah, and that's going to be interesting because it's bringing together all the public development banks.
Public development banks, so those are the institutions that are owned by governments, right?
Yeah, and they control trillions of dollars in assets.
So they could play a huge role in financing climate action.
They could. And this summit will be a good indicator of how committed they are to aligning their investments with climate goals.
So it's like a preview of what we might see at COP30.
In a way, yeah. And ultimately, COP30 is going to be a test of whether sustainable finance can regain momentum, whether it can chart a clear path forward amidst all the challenges we've been talking about.
It's almost like we're at a crossroads, aren't we?
I think that's a good way to put it.
So let's recap for a minute because we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah, it's been a whirlwind tour of the financial sector and climate change.
So on the one hand, we've got these major financial institutions. They're quietly acknowledging that we're heading towards a much hotter world than we'd hoped.
Yeah, they're planning for 3 degrees of warming, maybe even more.
And they're starting to factor that into their risk assessments, their investment strategies, all of that.
But at the same time, we're seeing a retreat from public commitments to climate action, especially in the U.S.
Right. Banks are pulling out of climate alliances. There's a backlash against ESG. The political winds are shifting.
And it's creating this weird disconnect, this gap between what they're saying publicly and what they're doing privately.
And then you've got the whole issue of adaptation. How prepared are we for the actual physical impacts of climate change?
And the answer, at least according to the research, is not very.
especially not in the U.S.
Yeah, American banks are lagging behind their European counterparts in
Yeah.
terms of both adaptation and mitigation efforts.
And central banks, they're playing an increasingly important role, but it seems like they're heavily influenced by national political agendas.
So in some countries, they're actively promoting green finance. In others, they're taking a much more cautious approach.
It's a complex landscape, that's for sure.
It is, and it raises a lot of questions about the future of sustainable finance. Like, where do we go from here?
It's like we're seeing this tension between recognizing the risks and actually taking the steps needed to address them.
Yeah, it's like there's this cognitive dissonance at the heart of the financial sector's response to climate change.
And it makes you wonder, what are the real priorities here? What kind of future are we financing?